It was good, you too. Who was like, God is back. And in this one, I wanted to do a little follow up to my last video about how God prepared Israel for the New Testament, or the Messianic Writings of the apostles and the earliest Christians. Right when the Messiah came to Israel and entered Jerusalem and all of those things, they have their record. And what I want to show is how God prepared the Hebrews for this revelation. And I got a couple of different pieces, because one of the arguments that people say is the fact that the Old Testament was written in Hebrew and the New Testament was written in Greek. Again, this was by no fault of the actual children of Israel. They had no control over the Greek conquest that was predicted in the Bible in the first place, right? But people use that as a type of disconnect between the Old Testament and New Testament. Now, in the last video, I already established how there's no theological disconnect. There's no cultural disconnect from the New Testament and the Old Testament, because when we look closely, the New Testament better represents the thinking of ancient Israelites and the Israelite diaspora way more than modern Judaism, because in many ways rabbis changed their doctrinal positions, theologically speaking, in response to Christ and in response to the church that was growing from him. So when we put these things in their original Hebrew context, we see that the New Testament better represents ancient Hebrew thinking in terms of theology, in terms of this, that, and the third. So just because it's written in Greek, we look at the source material and see how connected it is to the so-called Israelite diaspora that's going on with God's people. But here's the other thing. What a lot of this argument avoids is that people who make New Testament was written in Greek, while the Old Testament was written in Hebrew. The Old Testament is written in more than just Hebrew. Old Testament is also written in Aramaic, which is a similar language. And then outside of Aramaic, you have Greek loanwords and Persian loanwords, especially in the book of Daniel. So what this means is that God used more than just Hebrew to communicate the message of the prophets to his people. Put another way, in God's revelation to his people, because the Bible says the Hebrews were the first to see the God's revelation, right? The Apostle Paul talks about this. This is clear from the Old Testament itself, right? In that covenant, God is using more than just Hebrew to reveal his plan and his message to his people. So when people say the New Testament was written in Greek, well, the Old Testament was written in more than just Hebrew. The argument falls on itself, because we dive into what the Old Testament was written in. Plus, there are certain verses and certain words that are Greek loanwords, Persian loanwords. From that perspective, we can also see how the Old Testament was translated into Greek as well. Very common translation called the Septuagint, which is also in the New Testament. So many Jews were familiar with using a Greek translation of the Bible anyway. All right, so just dismissing something because the language is written is retarded. All right, all due respect, that's not an argument that gets into putting things under scrutiny and testing if they're true or not. If you just don't like the language something is written in, well, even from the Old Testament, we can see how that's problems for you if you're the one making the argument. We also have this fact. We have prophecy. We have eyewitnesses to prophecy in Jewish history. Right? We have the Maccabees, these ancient Hebrews, these ancient Israelites went through the conflict between the sons of Greece and the sons of Zion that Zechariah and Daniel predicted. Now, this sets a very important precedent of real Jews living through events that were predicted and giving their own records of it. So when we get to the New Testament, which is a record of the Messiah when he was sent to Israel, is the exact same situation. Right? We have Jews living through events prophesied by the Old Testament, giving their records of it. And we already established how the New Testament better represents authentic thinking of ancient Jews in and outside the land of Israel, right? Well, the temple is still standing in the Israelite diaspora, right? Authentic thinking is preserved in the New Testament. So we already established how Hebraic these Messianic writings are. So in the same way they give their testimony, we already have the Maccabees give their testimony of living through the oracles that God foretold through the prophets, all right? So we already got Greek squared away. We already got the theological stuff squared away. What they're giving is a record in the same way that the Maccabees gave their record. And so we have a precedent for that, for eyewitnesses of prophecy giving their records of it. Another thing I want to point out is in the New Testament, there are a lot of Semiticisms and Aramaicisms, if that's a word, meaning even though we look at the text and it's written in Greek, the original manuscripts, there's a lot of things that have like a Hebraic root, technically Aramaic, that suggests that the person that was writing this stuff was familiar with Aramaic and they're sort of bringing it into a Greek context. All that is to say, again, while they are writing in Greek, there's an Israelite root to this stuff that is expressed in how they think and what they believe about the world, right? So we have that, and we also have how when Jesus is talking, there's some times where he actually speaks in the original language, and one of the Gospels will actually translate the phrase. I believe it's in Mark when the little girl, he calls her to rise, and he says, Talitha kumi. Now that's the original language. So Mark is leaving the original language there and telling you what it means. So this also brings us back to the original root of the Jesus movement when they would have been speaking their own language, because that's also preserved. All right, so even though there's Greek, there's a Aramaic root to this stuff that we can look and see when we look at the text and everything like that. And that makes sense because Greek was like the lingua franca. Greek was a very common language in that day. I believe it was the official trade language as well. So all that being said, it makes sense that imagine if the most crazy extraterrestrial supernatural experience happened to you that transformed the world as we know it, and you wanted the message to go out. It makes sense that you would tell your homies and your people in the way that you understand and the language that you speak, right? I'm speaking English, so if I saw something and I want to let people know, I would let everybody around me know in a way they would understand. But if I wanted the message to go viral and the message to go widespread, it makes sense that I would speak in a language that the masses would understand. Now, English is a very widespread language because of like the colonies and everything like that. But if I was speaking in a very like culturally less known language, it makes sense that I would speak to those orally around me in that language, but I would try to express the message to the masses, in a language that they would understand, in this case being Greek. So that type of thing, which is what you would expect in a situation like this, is exactly what we see in the New Testament, where the church begins in Jerusalem and expands outward, where they're talking to each other and, building believers, by word of mouth. And then when these things get written, they're written in Greek because then the message of Messiah reaches more people in the Roman Empire. All right, and this has prophetic significance because we know how in both Testaments, but mainly the Old Testament, it predicts the salvation of the Gentiles. But one day when the nations will come and worship the Most High and seize their idolatry and swear their allegiance to the Most High God, Yahweh or Yahweh of the Bible, this name right here, instead, right? We take for granted how much Christ transformed the world we know both in the West and the East. All right, so it makes sense if we're going to reach these people, which again has prophetic significance of these idolaters who within a few generations, or maybe themselves being that generation who worshipped idols, leaving all that behind and worshiping the Most High of the Bible, right? We're getting within the first generations of that happening on a massive level. It makes sense that you're going to write to people in a way that they're going to understand so that the message reaches more people. It might be a little hard for us to imagine because English is one of the most official common languages in the world, so we take that for granted. But imagine if we were all Spanish speaking and we saw something crazy. We would tell each other in Spanish, our family in Spanish, but if we wanted the message everybody to hear in the Western world, we'd probably communicate that message in English, right? Assuming that we're bilingual, because more people will know that. All right. So ancient people weren't stupid. A lot of them knew multiple languages and knew Greek and everything like that. So it makes sense that that's the backdrop. And it gives us a little framework into just breaking this thing down and see how sensible it actually is. So that's what I wanted to say. In the New Testament, we have the apostles and the earliest followers, who were all Hebrews, believed that the Messiah had come. This includes members from the tribe of Judah, from the tribe of Levi, and others. And they were so convinced that the Messiah came and that he rose, which we can empirically test historically and by being students of prophecy, using mathematics and science, all these things that go beyond not only a shadow, but I would say a sliver of a doubt, go past that point to show that Christ did honestly resurrect as a matter of historical fact. They were so convinced about this message, not only were they willing to put their necks on the line for it, those who were closest to him, but we can see they wanted to let the other tribes of Israel know that he came. This is one of the forgotten messages of the New Testament. If you look at it carefully, we can see there's a direct wanting to let the tribes of Israel know that the Messiah had come and that they were witnesses to it. Outside of that, they want the Gentiles to know the message so that they can stop worshiping idols and come to the Most High. So when we put all these things into perspective, what we have with the New Testament is these beautiful Messianic writings with the whole testimony of when the Messiah came to Jerusalem. We can test them, put them under scrutiny. We can believe and disbelieve and see how these things are vindicated when we do. All right? But we have this testimony of Jews in fulfillment of the prophets, and that's why altogether it is one unified story. Get rid of the word Christianity if that's a stumbling block, because that comes in the 2nd century anyway. The root of this is all Hebraic stuff, a Hebrew context, ancient Israelite context. Let's put ourselves back on the front lines of that and then go outward from all of that perspective, right? Let's put ourselves back into ancient Israel and the tribes themselves and go outward from that perspective. We can see how all these pieces begin to show together. So that's what I wanted to say. Just a little video about how God prepared the Israelites for the New Testament, what the New Testament is, what it represents, and how we have a precedent for these Israelite eyewitnesses to God's oracles already some 100-something years before Christ. All right. So there's no argument against the New Testament from that perspective. Paul talks about like taking all these destroying lofty arguments, destroying these whack ass arguments against the Messiah when he came. All right. Y'all be blessed, and I will see you in the next video. All right. Y'all be blessed in the Messiah. Peace.